Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight on Labour Day to discuss events is author, columnist and political commentator Chris Trotter and former Green Party MP, poverty activist and blogger Sue Bradford. Welcome to you both. Coming up on tonight's final show for 2011, Issue 1, what are the challenges confronting the modern union movement politically in New Zealand? Issue 2, is globalisation strengthening or weakening unions? And Issue 3, what solutions must unions champion for 2014? Plus we'll wrap with a final thought, but let's start the show with Issue 1. From the ports of Auckland fiasco to the brutal Tallies AFCO lockout, from teachers facing attacks throughout the education sector to state sector cutbacks, from a manufacturing jobs crisis to new labour laws weakening unions. The first year of the second term of the national government has seen attack after attack on the unions. So what are the challenges confronting the modern union movement politically in New Zealand?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is unions coming to understand that voting isn't enough, that supporting a political party isn't enough, that the only way unions are going to get real power at the political level again is by building their numbers and strength, so that parties like Labour and the Greens and any other left or centre-left parties in Parliament will actually do more, have the courage to take more risks and to do a lot more in terms of creating an environment that works, that stands up for the needs of workers and of unions. So because we haven't had that. All those years of a Labour government, what changed? You know, we fiddled around the edges of the ERA. Some of us tried to get them to go further, but that was tough. They wouldn't. In the end, Parliament and those parties will not do it unless the unions have the numbers, the strength and the determination to push the parties, to have the courage to take the risks, to stand up to the ruling class.
Unions are some of the biggest backers of the left-wing political parties we have in New Zealand, yet their interests, genuine interests in like giving them more muscle and power, seem to be completely ignored. Why do you think that is?
Well, because the Labour in particular, even though they pay a lot of lip service and attention to the unionists in their ranks and the traditional role of organised labour within the Labour Party, in fact, when they had those 9 years of power, what did they do? Nowhere near enough, far too little. And now it's lost again and we're rapidly going backwards. And that's why I think the only way of turning that around and of pushing the Greens in a good direction as well is by the unions building their power and understanding that they can't just let their interests be represented by people in Parliament, that the unions themselves have to exert that pressure and have the numbers and the determination to push the political parties.
Chris, New Zealand's social strata has changed immensely in the 30-year reign of neoliberal politics. Where does solidarity and egalitarianism fit into a consumer culture, and how does the union movement confront that cultural challenge?
Well, it is a structural problem that they face, you're quite right. The neoliberal revolution enshrined individualism at the very centre of New Zealand culture. And everything that the neoliberal political class has done since 1984 has been to reinforce individualism at the expense of the collective approach which unions typify. So what unions have to do is they have to try and not so much eliminate individualism, because I think that is too big an ask, but it's a question of making individuals feel that while their own interests are important, they are not beings unto themselves, that for their own survival they must rely on other human beings. And it's the promotion of that idea that we are dependent upon one another and that we must enshrine that idea in the centre of our social thinking that I think the unions have to come to grips with. And there's only one way that I can see that they can do that. And that is to accept that the 25 years or so that voluntary union membership has been part of New Zealand law has been an experiment which is now very clear in terms of its outcomes. The outcomes of voluntary membership of unions is that less than 1 in 10 private sector workers will belong to a union.
Yeah.
The effective destruction of mass unionism will in the end mean that even the large unions in the public sector that remain will come under attack, as they have all around the world, most particularly in the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the idea that we must have members by conviction, not by compulsion, which drove, I think, a lot of the left-wing thinking about unions for a very long time, based, I suppose, on people's experiences of 1951, when the compulsory unions, like the shop employees and the clerical workers, were able to dominate the FOL, and the true hard men of the watersiders and the miners who didn't need these laws were betrayed by the conscripted unionists. But the simple fact is now that there are hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who are denied the benefits of union membership and union coverage, and that the experiment with voluntarism, which really once again reflects this placing the individual at the centre. Oh, it's up to you. You must decide whether or not a union is a good idea or not. Doesn't matter whether the boss is able to use you against those who want to belong to unions. Never mind that the individual gets given the wage rise even though the individual has contributed nothing to its achievement. All of these things are part and parcel of the neoliberal project. To defeat it, you have to, I think, make union membership universal once again.
So we have a government actively punishing the poor and dismantling workers' rights. Yet TV3's last poll rated National more popular than they were at the election. Do New Zealanders, do you think, want to punish the poor and dismantle workers' rights? I mean, is there something in the New Zealand character that actually wants to have a go at the less fortunate?
There's two questions there. I mean, there's a very deliberate drive by corporate New Zealand always to want to maximise profit, to press workers' wages and conditions down as far as possible. And we've had government after government that's acted in their interest. I think that's one question. The second area, which is the one I work on in most at the moment, which is with unemployed people and beneficiaries, is where we've got this dreadful attitude through it feels like far too much of the population, and especially I think from middle class, but also other people who demonise beneficiaries and unemployed and treat them as less than. And Paula Bennett is the absolute epitome of that, kicking at the very place she came from is like her worst enemy, and she's taking this to a level I've not seen in my lifetime in terms of the intimidation, harassment and bullying and of unemployed people and beneficiaries. And it's an atrocious aspect of the New Zealand psyche. At the same time, though, there are many, many New Zealanders who, as Chris has talked about, do believe in solidarity, that do believe in compassion and love, and that we should support each other, and that every child that's born deserves a chance at life. And I think it's the job of unions, because this is a union program, to think about all this and what role unions can play, and as some unions are starting to do, to reach out into their communities and go past the traditional union psychology of saying, well, the world breaks into two between people who are a member of a union, who are in employment, and those who aren't. That unions need to start breaking through that and look at community organising. The Living Wage campaign is a prize example of that, with the Service and Food Workers Union taking the lead, but many unions and community groups supporting that campaign. Another example of the new ways of organising is the Migrants Union, that network that the first union set up. Starting to break down some of those boundaries between the organised and the unorganised, between the employed and the unemployed, between employed and their family members, because it's in all our interest to mobilise that, and that's the only real way we'll start to do what we talked about before, and to resist and make real change and force those parties in Parliament to make real change as well.
Chris, when you get weak unions, you get high inequality. Our level of inequality is at its recorded highest. Right-wing blogger David Farrar was arguing the new youth wage should be expanded to every beneficiary and not just those under 19 years of age. How much worse could it get for workers in New Zealand?
Well, I mean, the terminus of neoliberalism in terms of the workplace is to have no unions at all. And the most remarkable thing about the Employment Contracts Act, I think for many people, especially observers from overseas, was that here was a piece of legislation organising the labour market in New Zealand, and the word union did not appear in it. And this was not simply a blow against New Zealand workers, but it was, in a sense, a flag raised by the far right against what the International Labour Organisation has stood for since World War I. It really was the ECA, a flagship for the whole of the international neoliberal movement. This was about as good as it could get without General Pinochet's guns and tanks. That's the ideal, I suppose.
A gentleman's fascism.
Because that's where Milton Friedman and his Chicago boys began to put these theories into place. But it comes back to the question that you put to Sue. I remember when the fourth Labour government began to introduce its changes. One of the union leaders, it may have been Rob Campbell, it may have been Bill Anderson, I'm not quite sure which it was, but they said the only way these sort of policies are going to be imposed upon New Zealand is if you have soldiers in the streets. Now that was wrong. There is something in New Zealand which means that you don't need to have your General Pinochet to implement these sorts of reforms. I'm not quite sure what it is.
We're quite passive?
There is a sort of passivity in some parts of New Zealand, a great almost worship of authority. But I think there's something, you know, even more concerning than that, and it's that sense that if you're all right and someone else isn't, the most important thing is for you to stay all right. Right. Not to put your all rightness at risk.
Final question of both of you. The Depression of the 30s helped shape the union movement and politics in New Zealand. How do you think this recession has shaped those forces this time around?
Well, it's too soon to know the real answer to that, but I think that you know, the inspiring things I see out of what's happening are the new moves to reach out to the community, the new solidarity that we saw in situations like the ports of Auckland, where lots of different unions came in behind, including internationally, where people from community and church organisations came in behind the wharfies, very different from 51 in some respects. And starting to see that willingness to mobilise and reach out, I think that's really exciting. I'm also hopeful that there will be increasing willingness by unions to understand that unemployed workers are workers too, and that beneficiaries are actually workers too, and that our interests are aligned, that we are the same class, and that our interests are the same, and that there's a mutual support that can be built on and developed. And the same, as I said, the beginnings of migrant workers organisation, which also impacts on their families, huge area of need there. And the first union's approach to that, I think, is amazing, the work they're doing, and that's really going to grow. So who knows? But if we can harness these forces, if we can have inspiring union leadership, courageous union leadership, young unionists who go out and work with young workers, because there's a whole generation, people keep talking about the risk of the young people who have no idea of what solidarity means, no idea what a union is. They have bosses that intimidate and bully them, so they're too frightened to join a union. If we could start to turn some of that around, then I see a lot of hope for the unions in this country.
How has the global economic recession shaped events this time around?
Well, I think the great difference between the Great Depression and the Great Recession is that the Great Depression swept over the working class, and then it swept over the middle class. Right. And what that did all around the world was set up an unusual degree of solidarity between the two classes. Right. In some countries, the middle class veered sharply to the right. Yep. But in many countries, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Sweden, there was a coming together of the classes and a building of that sense of social solidarity that we were discussing earlier. This time, with the Great Recession, it has rolled over people without work, beneficiaries. It has rolled over a great many working class people, made them very fearful if they have jobs of risking any kind of action in relation to trade union work or anything at all that might jeopardise their position. But much worse than that, because the tide did not reach into those leafy suburbs, it has really accentuated that I'm all right, and I'm not going to allow anything to affect my all rightness, and those people out there are a threat, and I don't like them, and I want them kept as far away from me as possible.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. With the TPPA due to be discussed in New Zealand in December, is globalisation a threat or is it the solution to workers' rights? Sue, reading through the contract for Power Rangers actors that Gordon Campbell posted online this month suggests bonded servitude rather than negotiated employment details. Do you think the government's been too quick to rewrite our labour laws in the film industry for corporate Hollywood?
Oh, of course they have. I mean, it's unbelievable that we had a government that was willing to make a new law in the interests of a Hollywood production company. I mean, it's ridiculous that we ever did that. But I think in terms of globalisation more broadly, there are pros and cons for the workers' struggle. The pros are the race to the cons are the race to the bottom, the casualisation of workforce between countries, the competition. I mean, we seem to be going into an even more rapid cycle of sending jobs offshore and then sometimes bringing them back again. When our labour becomes cheaper than the labour overseas, back and forth, and so moving more and more quickly like that as capital seeks the cheapest price of labour. But on the other side of it, I've been really interested to see some of the growing strength of global unions who are counter-organising. And I've just seen about the Pakistan settlement between, I think it's Unilever and a Food Workers International Union, where they actually achieved massive gains for the local tea workers by involving unions and community activists from all over the world. And I find those stories really inspiring, where first world workers and community people can get alongside workers in a third world country, targeting the same boss, and achieve real gains, huge gains in that case, for the workers on the ground in a developing country. So
Chris,
there's different aspects to it.
Sure. Just picking up on that, Chris, the Maritime Union, of course, brought in American unions to threaten an Auckland port blacklist, and NZDWU leaned on Fonterra to allow South American unions access to workplaces there. Could globalisation be used by unions? And what are your thoughts on the CTU reaching out to the Chinese unions? Is that something that we could be doing as well?
Well, I'll get to that. The short answer is yes, of course, but the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, and prior to that, the Chinese Communist Party leadership's embrace of what was essentially a sort of state-guided capitalism, opened up labour markets which had been hitherto ring-fenced from the capitalist world. When those walls came down, the number of workers available increased by hundreds of millions. Now, if we want to get all economistic on the issue, you could say that there was a vast increase in the supply of labour. So what do you think is going to happen to the price of labour? It's going to go down. The situation in Europe now is very precarious, because what more and more of the bureaucrats in the EU and the right-wing politicians in the EU countries are saying is that the welfare state was a nice try, but it's too expensive, it's not sustainable long term. If these economies are ever going to grow again, we have to dramatically reduce the amount of spending on welfare, and we have to dramatically increase the incentives for people to get back into the workforce, regardless of hitherto exaggerated notions about what their labour was worth. So what globalisation is doing is really putting massive pressure on the cost of labour all over the world, driving it down as fast as it can. This has happened before to an extent, with the first great wave of globalisation prior to World War I. And at that time you did get huge solidarity between working classes in Australia and the dockers in London. You had a sort of Pacific rim of trade unionists, the western seaboard of the United States, Auckland, the eastern seaboard of Australia. These things need to happen again. The Western unions need to do all they can to drive up the cost of labour in places like China and in India, and to strengthen unions in those countries if at all possible, because otherwise that ineluctable drive to push wages down will simply continue.
Final question to both of you. We saw vast abuse of migrant workers this year, from underpaid food service staff to allegations of effectively slavery at sea in our fishing industry. This is another facet of globalisation. It's actually turned up on our shores, hasn't it? Are we dealing and coping with that?
Oh, no, we're not. I mean, we had just the case the other day where First Union actually had to go in and rescue a woman who was being held in slavery by a couple here in the suburbs of Auckland. So how much of this is really going on? I mean, we've had this, it's been decades actually of the exploitation of migrant labour, most of it invisible to most of us. But what I do find exciting is that at least one union is starting to take it seriously, and I think that network of union migrant activists is going to just keep growing.
Is this a silent shame? The level of abuse of migrant workers in New Zealand?
Well, it's certainly something which New Zealanders would not have anticipated, and I suspect 20 years ago simply wouldn't have tolerated. But this is, once again, neoliberalism's great success. Its ideological hegemony is now almost undisputed across the planet. I mean, there are challenges emerging, like the Occupy movement. There are people in the developing world, as Sue was alluding to earlier, who are pushing back. But it is very difficult to find not dissent, not protest, not in some cases outright rebellion, but a cogent alternative to the neoliberal paradigm. That's what is lacking.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3, it's one of the great ironies of left-wing politics that the union movement seemed to end up weaker after 9 years of a Labour government. What solutions does the movement need to take to the electorate in 2014? So has the government and their employer allies underestimated Helen Kelly as CTU president, because she's managed some major industrial victories in the face of some appalling pressure? Had some written the union movement off too early? Yeah,
I think that's dead right, and I've been really impressed at how Helen Kelly's really matured in that job. I think she had a really tough time when she started, but when she came up to Auckland and spent time here on the wharves with the workers here, and in the building of that struggle, I really saw her starting to shine, and I think there's been a huge underestimation of her, and I'm thrilled that she continues to be president of the CTU. But yes, behind that, I think they have underestimated, and even though it's tough for unions right now, I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of really good things going on.
Chris, how important was the Māori and union hui held last month in Tauranga in the wake of the Tallies AFCO dispute? Is that a unique New Zealand solution?
Yes, that was. And I'm fascinated as to how the parallel growth of parties like Mana, the iwi Leadership Collective, as they now call it, and what survives of our trade union movement, particularly in those poverty-stricken areas of the country, which strangely enough seem to have the highest proportion of Maori citizens. I mean, this is something which is going to be very interesting to watch. There are clear, to me at least, class divisions within Maoridom which are sharpening. But that Tallies dispute was a case where I think older values overcame perhaps the newer, sharper, more commercial values of the iwi corporates.
So is the living wage a 2014 solution?
It's part of it. A living wage is always a huge thing that we all have to fight for, employed and unemployed, because I see the living wage as being about income support as well as about employed wages, sure. That's huge. But there's some other things that I think unions really have to fight for between now and 2014 to try and influence a possible Labor-led government, and one of them is that there should be penalties on bosses who intimidate and trick workers out of joining the union or even realising they have a right to join a trade union. And it happens every day out there in the workplace. Workers are sheerly intimidated into not belonging to unions, and that's one of the big things holding unions back and holding workers back. The second, and that could be legislated for, and huge penalties. What if it cost an employer $100,000 if they bully a 17-year-old worker out of joining the union? And that's what should be happening. The second thing is, as everyone knows, many of our workplaces are small. It is way beyond the capacity of our unions to organise effectively in these many scattered small workplaces where so many workers are. We need to return to something like an award system, and there's various models around the world we could look at, and I know the CTU's done a lot of work on it. That must absolutely be at the top of any agenda.
Chris, your final word. We've got to wrap the show. Your final word for the show.
There are times when unions have broad issues to confront, but over the next few weeks, the unions, particularly those that are affiliated to the Labour Party, have some very specific work to do. They need to take hold of the Labour Party once again and make sure that it is answerable to the values that founded it and to the unions which largely now support it. So that piece of work remains to be done over the next few weeks.
So your final word?
If you're not in a union, you're in a workplace, join it now. If you're in Auckland and you're an unemployed or beneficiary and want to get organised, contact us at Auckland Action Against Poverty. Only together can we fight back and gain power.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sue. To my final word. Ladies and gentlemen, one thing has become abundantly clear to me over the 27 episodes of this series. Jack and Jane may be as good as their master, but they sure as hell don't have the same negotiating power. We have historic inequality because the employment reforms of the 1990s dramatically weakened the New Zealand union movement. When bargaining with employers who have all the capital and power, working people have only one threat: withdrawal of their labour. In 2014, we need politicians who will make giving unions back their teeth the top priority. Unions can't negotiate with both hands tied behind their back, so political parties focused on reversing our inequality rates must give unions back the right to strike and to engage in solidarity strikes. Employers will never take bargaining seriously if the real threat of strike action is tethered and leashed into a good faith bargaining process that is more faith than good. If we are serious about fighting inequality, we must give the union movement back its muscle. The right to strike and to strike in solidarity is a freedom of association the New Zealand worker must seize back and reclaim for the egalitarian good of this nation. On Labour Day, when New Zealand declared 40 hours a week as a fair deal, we need to remind ourselves that such progress never occurs without struggle. Thanks for watching Aotearoa. Good night, New Zealand.